we're excited this evening, if the mic stops popping on me, to explore the connections between Indy's own Kurt Vonnegut and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which celebrates its 200th year this year. And we're going to do something a little different today. I have to say we've never done anything like this before. We're actually going to read a short play called Fortitude by Vonnegut. And we have people scattered throughout the audience that are going to help us with that reading. Then afterwards, we'll go into a conversation between Dr. Emily Beckmann and Dr. Marc Leeds here. So I'm going to introduce you to these two individuals, and then we'll get started with our reading. So, Dr. Marc Leeds, a native of New York City, received his doctorate from the University of Buffalo. Dr. Leeds knew Kurt Vonnegut for the final 20 years of Vonnegut's life, and that's where he developed this deep knowledge of Vonnegut and his work. Leeds' first version of the Vonnegut Encyclopedia was published in 1995, followed by a second fully revised edition with Vonnegut's publisher Delacorte in October of 2016. It is more than twice the size of the original volume. And Marc Leeds is one of the first people contacted by Julia Whitehead, the founder and CEO of the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library here in Indianapolis. So, since its inception, nearly 10 years ago, Leeds has served on the library's board of directors. Mr. Leeds' four books on Vonnegut have made him a sought-after Vonnegut authority by academics worldwide. In conversation with Dr. Leeds is Dr. Emily Beckmann. Mark. In conversation with Mark is Emily. It's a conversation. That's right. It was getting more informal. Fair enough. So Dr. Beckmann, Emily, has served as the director of the Medical Humanities and Health Studies program at the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI since 2016. She's also adjunct assistant professor of medicine at Indiana University School of Medicine, and in 2010 completed a fellowship in clinical medical ethics at the Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. Dr. Beckmann's research focuses largely on hope at the end of life, empathy in medical education, narrative, and most recently an interdisciplinary approach to understanding the history and representation of mental health and illness in Indiana's former Central State Hospitals. And I think after we read the play, you'll understand why we put Emily in conversation with Mark for this hilarious play by Vonnegut. So, just to give you a little bit of background about why we're having this conversation, why talk about Frankenstein and Vonnegut. This year, Indiana Humanities is encouraging Hoosiers across the state to read Frankenstein in honor of this 200th anniversary. And as part of this Quantum Leap initiative that we have, we're investigating the intersection of science, technology, and the humanities. So this program has been made possible with the generous support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And finally, we'd like to thank our good friends at the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library for making it possible to bring Dr. Leeds here this evening, and to Scarlet Lane Brewing for bringing us the beer of horror. If you sampled the beer, it's all horror themed, so enjoy that as well. So, like I said, we'll be beginning with a reading of the play, which I hope you enjoy and find it as funny and strange as I do. And I want you to, afterwards, we'll thank all of our readers who are scattered through the audience, but I want to thank you in advance for agreeing to take part in this reading. All right, so let's
just mention one thing about this.
Yeah, go for it.
I know we're about to be Vonnegut, but 200 years ago, Mary Shelley had to publish anonymously because she was a woman. And it wasn't until later editions that she got acknowledgement. So, on this 200th anniversary, I get pink socks, she has blue shoes. So, we're doing all right.
Here we go.
All right, well, I think what we'll do is...
First off, thank you, actors and actresses.
Yes, for sure. Great.
Really terrific.
Okay, great. Yes, that was wonderful reading.
How many theater majors were here?
Well, that's great. So I think what we'll do is I have kind of a few topics maybe that I'll ask Mark to address and talk about, and then we'll certainly open it up so that everybody can join in the conversation, and hopefully we'll get to cover a lot of interesting things. But first, I think it would be interesting if you could talk a little bit about the influence of Shelley, and more specifically Frankenstein, on Vonnegut generally, and on Fortitude specifically.
Well, Fortitude is dated 1968, This is even for a year before the publication of Slaughterhouse-Five, which will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of next year. And this was a time when he was still not financially set. I mean, he had a couple of things going for him. He had a Guggenheim at that point. He had gone to Dresden to work on Slaughterhouse-Five, but this is a guy with 6 children, a wife, a house, and wherever he's living to support. So he was trying to be an active and current writer. And the market for short stories and plays especially began to shrink in the 50s. So the fact that he even wrote a short play as a way of making any money is a little bit ridiculous, because what theater is going to invest a whole lot of money in a very brief play? On the other hand, the people who teach things like medical ethics, I don't know if there's a better text, I don't know if there's more topics that come up in this one brief moment of a play than this. Vonnegut, it's funny because I don't really think of Vonnegut as a science fiction writer. I'm sure everybody talks about this, but this is the most sciencey he is in anything. Descriptions of tubes and transistors and pipes going all over the place. And just in that brief description, there's more science than Mary Shelley ever wrote into the original book, as you read. So the fact that that's even a science fiction book, it's really more of a social fiction to me about what do we do with these big questions. And I think Kurt was always involved with the big questions, dating back to his first novel, and certainly in his short stories. There was some of that, although those were mostly aimed at his magazine readers, colliers, and Saturday Evening Post, things like that. But his novels were all about the big questions, and certainly Mary Shelley really was the first person to bring it up in prose, and she had to do it anonymously at first. But she came from, I'm getting outside the bounds of your question, but her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, hugely important in having a statement declared about the rights of women. And this is still read in colleges. I doubt you read it in your medical ethics class, but I used to have freshmen read it. It's short enough, and it's certainly smart enough and relevant at all times. But Kurt was always interested in these big questions. How do we treat each other? How do we take care of each other? In this case, how long should we be taking care of each other? I mean, there is that question now. We suffer diseases now that man never really had to experience because we don't live this old. We didn't. So I think that Fortitude became a consolidation of not just Kurt's sense of humor, but the really big questions. And he did it in the most sciencey way that he ever does in his novels. As I said, this is the most science fiction of anything he's ever written. I could just imagine what you do with medical students, confronting first Vonnegut, because you're going to laugh at it, and then, well, let's step away from the humor and deal with this as a real topic. How long do we prolong life?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And how close are we getting to this point? It may not be as far off and out there as we usually think.
That's right.
Yeah. What was it, do you think, about Frankenstein, the text, that inspired or motivated Vonnegut, or that he was drawn to? And did that play a role in how he created this particular play, do you think? I'm interested what he sort of thought about it.
First I'll say, I never had a conversation with him about this.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I tried to have a relationship with him that was more, he was an uncle. And he would call me up and ask about the kids. And there were only 2 times I remember, once in writing and once in person, I asked him things about the writing. And I told him, I promise I'll never do this after this. And so I never spoke with him about this in particular. All I can gather is that, again, Mary Shelley was the first one to put into prose these questions. And not only did the novel live, here we are 200 years later, but it spawned, as we know, all sorts of cinematic machinations. Almost none of which have anything to do with the book.
Right, exactly.
And you might as well watch Abbott Costello and Frankenstein, And I was quipping before that I was driving around last night and I noticed that we were about to have no moon at all tonight, which is great. That means the Wolfman won't be able to show up and comment on Frankenstein the way we know we eventually had him do in the movies. These things got crazy, but just the idea of, a doctor seamstress putting together a body, how do we put that and make that into life? And somebody made cinema out of it. And, well, let's face it was good cinema for the time, and it's still fun to watch it. It's even more fun to watch Young Frankenstein. Which has all the same science in it, which was not in the book. I think they even used the same sets, they said. So he really tried, Mel Brooks, got to it. But all of these questions were first posed in the vernacular, let's say, by Mary Shelley. Yes, you had Wordsworth at the time and the Romantic poets, but unless you were inclined to read them, and even Wordsworth, proud of writing in the vernacular, if one was not drawn to poetry to begin with, but you were drawn to reading to some extent, this asks all of the same questions that I think the Romantic poets certainly confronted. And what I like about it is, in keeping with Kurt's beliefs, we can put off God almost forever, scientifically.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to sort of mark that I want to come back to the Frankenstein as perhaps a cautionary tale, and whether or not Fortitude might also be somewhat of a cautionary tale. But before we do that, does this speak, at least in part, to his views, perhaps on technology and the development of technology and progress and that kind of thing?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
Going back to Player Piano and Deer in the Woods, a short story that preceded it. His exposure to technology at GE with his brother Bernard, and the ideas he got there. I mean, that's where he got the idea for IS-9. It was given to him, Irving Langmuir, Nobel scientist. I think he always saw, I remember when I was a kid, wasn't it GE progress is our most important product? Right. They don't say that anymore, do they? But I remember as a kid, that was the moniker, you go with that. And I think Kurt was able to see the progress that we were making scientifically and say, this is kind of interesting. I just came out of a war where we equaled with one bomb what we did with all the conventional arms. So if you can funnel down your technology to such efficiency and real effectiveness it always happens in the military first. But you can do that then in the civilian side. How does that impact society? And this is similar to the concepts in the story Anti-Garrison, where there's this drug to not become a gerontological patient, I suppose. So you don't have to face those things, and you extend life forever. And what does it do? It causes a housing shortage. People are living generations within one apartment. I think these were questions when he saw them going from Dresden to Hiroshima. You go from, you know, what was absolutely insane to, are you kidding me? That's almost magical. And then you're at your brother's place of work and you see these scientists create magic, basically. I think it was easy to sort of continue speculating, where are we going to go with this? And I was in the Apple store 3 hours ago. And I told Julie Whitehead this, and Meredith also. I had a dream a couple of weeks ago. And 3 hours ago I got to relive it. Because in the Apple store there's a variety of drones, flying drones, and specifically made so that you can run it off your iPhone. I don't know what you Android people do. And I started to think, like, this is like too much. 2 weeks ago I had the dream and now they're presenting me these things. And I've got to wait for my phone and I got to think about this. Well, my dream was this. Drones, right, can become a great new protest item. And you can do it almost anonymously. And I noticed, my older daughter went to Georgia Tech, and they had been experimenting with drones, or hives of drones. So you get like 150, and they fly like flocks of birds, and it becomes very hard as a target to hit any one of them, and all of them are equipped to be able to decimate a target. I'm looking at the drones. My dream was this. What would happen if somebody took a drone, took a bucket of red paint beneath it, and flew it into the White House doors in protest of what's going on right now? So I called up one of my daughters who's a lawyer. She said, Daddy, we spoke about this, getting arrested is not an option. Because that's what I used to tell them when they were in their early days. But she did give me a connection for the National Lawyers Guild in Washington. She says, every district has a different dream. I can only think of about 6 felonies you'll commit with that dream. I said, well, I'll just have to write it up. But I do think that things like that, we can have drone warfare now. Nobody's on the battlefield, but we're blowing the hell out of everything. What's the cost of war then? If we can wage war, that becomes a Terminator world after a while. Terminator was what, in the middle 80s? And now we have drone warfare occurring. We're getting faster to this point, I think.
And robots?
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
I mean, it all depends on how you define a robot.
Yeah.
You know, you can define a robot, it's going to do this one thing, or it's going to have calculations like these hives of drones, where they can work in consort with each other, 150 at a time, to make sure that something gets through to a target. It's a scary world. I don't know. I don't want to live forever, but I do want to continue for a while.
So that's a kind of a nice segue then. Do you think, I mean, many of us could interpret Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a cautionary tale. We could also interpret perhaps Fortitude as a cautionary tale in a similar light. What do you think about that?
Because that more knowledge was acquired by the time Vonnegut wrote, his is, to me, more of a cautionary tale. Hers was a midnight dreary with the lightning going kind of fantasy with no scientific background except maybe what she was told or read in, in a newspaper here and there.
So you
This
don't,
is even
okay.
before Ben Franklin,
Okay.
you know?
So you don't think she, well, this is deviating from the topic of conversation, but you don't think that there wasn't a little bit in Frankenstein of be very careful how you proceed, be reflective?
Not knowing what she was exposed to in terms of technology in 1818.
Yeah.
Well, you had Franklin already, but
Galvanic.
galvanic responses, but nobody was really writing about this. It took a long time for somebody to really pick up on this and make a medical issue out of it. I think that she had such a limited knowledge of what was going to come down the pike that this was more a flight of fancy, but it was based upon, you know, she came from a very religious background. It was based upon all of those essential questions about afterlife, about what's our responsibility for each other. One of the things that I find, and I found this horrendous, when I first read it, Adam's first job in the Bible is to name everything in creation. Dr. Frankenstein never names his creation. So he's left without a, thank you very much, Mary. He's left without personhood, without an identification. And that's very much part of this story. He's left without an identity, and aside from companionship. A month ago, I come here and I'm thinking, all right, they'll introduce me, they know I'm from Brooklyn, so if I say, let's rename Frankenstein as, Frankie as a cock block, that's, I don't know about Indianapolis for that. Then a movie comes out. Did you see the advertisements for it? It's called Cock Block. I thought I was going to be ridiculous when I got here a month ago, and now they named a movie in the same way. So we're progressing very quickly.
Very quickly. So it's interesting because, right, so the creature or the monster, however you might define
Which one?
Frankenstein's creation, right? I tend to refer to him as a creature. Right, so as you pointed out, we question, is he a person, is he not? What does that mean? What is he capable of? Those kinds of things. How, and you know, we could have a lengthy conversation about that. How might that creation compare to Sylvia Lovejoy at this point in her existence? Sorry, that's way off script. But
It's above and beyond, but well, obviously Vonnegut thought it was close enough, you know, to use both Frankenstein's name and then Norbert Wiener's, you know, name in there, put them together. Norbert Wiener was a famous scientist in the 20th century. So in that respect, I think that Sylvia is a much more extreme case of the Dr. Frankenstein syndrome. I don't know that Dr. Frankenstein ever even conceived how long his creation might last. This guy's calculated it, 500 years, give or take. And by then, who knows, you could extend it maybe another 5,000 years at the rate of technology. So in that sense, I think that Sylvia Lovejoy is, and this is a word we've lost, is a sort of a vaudevillian extreme of the Frankenstein story. Because we laugh at these, you know, weighty jokes that Kurt puts in there, you know, the entire time. And we've also lost, I used to do with my kids, I would start a song from Nelson Eddy and Jeanette McDonald, but these days nobody knows what that is. They've got to look it up on YouTube or something to figure out, you know, really what's the significance of that and how romantic really would that be? And then if they, you know, put on and they see a little clip of it, they realize, oh my God, that was Vonnegut's reference for romance. So I think that we have to put that back into the classroom, just a little clip. Do you ever show it?
It's funny because my students, as they can attest, they're not allowed to have their computers, but frequently after we finish reading this, they'll say, we've got to know what that is, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Did you look it up?
I'm not
I
sure if this
forgot to,
class
yeah.
did.
Oh, you have to look it up. You have to see the clip, and then you're gonna, and
The med students certainly did.
And you'll sit there, and the first thing you'll say is, this was entertainment? Yes, it was. And it's hilarious. And then when you realize that Kurt uses this, again, in a vaudevillian way, to open up this new life that Frankenstein's going to have with Sylvia, with this song. And it's meant to be romantic, but in a vaudevillian way, the way the rest of this is, and so much of Kurt's humor is.
You know, it's funny, when you guys were reading that, Mel Brooks used that same song in Frankenstein. Madeline Kahn sings it to the monster the first time they're together.
Huh. If you don't know what that song is, we'll play it at the end.
Oh, perfect!
We listened to it earlier.
This just keeps getting better and better.
Billy Collins, eat your heart out. What I'm really enjoying about this is that fortitude should be what's in a freshman reader, not Harrison Bergeron. Harrison Bergeron, I found, and I taught it many times, is way too hard for students to grapple with. It's just too conflicting for them to take on those particular issues. But as freshmen, a lot of them are science majors, or they think they're going to be pre-med, something. And, okay, let's deal with questions that you can actually understand and that you might be treating in the future. And so I think fortitude is the one that they should be putting in those freshman readers or in the high school books, not Harrison Bergeron.
It's interesting because my undergraduate students, some of whom are present, and my medical students view this very differently, right? So the undergraduate students tend to ask questions about, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a person? At what point does Sylvia lose her personhood? So these kinds of real, almost existential questions. And the medical students are horrified.
Is it a freshman class of everybody, or just kids who think they're going to be pre-med?
Most of them are going into some sort of health-related field. Yeah,
Okay.
many think they're going to be pre-med.
So it's relevant to them too at that
It's
age.
relevant, absolutely, yeah. But the medical students, immediately turn to, we're doing this to patients right now, and we shouldn't be. And what kind of life is this? What kind of quality of life? So it's very different. It's much more, most pragmatic. The medical students and the undergrads are, what does this mean in terms of who we are and how we exist and this kind of thing.
The exact location of
What
the
do you
soul.
account for the difference between the freshmen and the first year med students?
I think medical students, so these are fourth-year medical students. And so by the time I see them in their fourth year,
Oh, they were all sciencey up.
they are focused, right, on what's the treatment, what's the outcome, right, and
How long can we prolong it?
How long can we prolong this? Exactly. Yeah, and the undergraduate students are extraordinary students, and they're not there. They're still really considering these questions, the big questions. Is this worth doing? Is this something we should be doing?
I realize that med school would never do this. That's why they keep it for the fourth year. I had one of my college mentors taught the same class that you did. Maybe they should give it to first year med
Yeah,
students.
absolutely, sure.
Before they all get scienced up and figure out that we can, solve everything.
Yeah. Right, yeah, exactly. That would be.
Well, and this does bring up the question of what limits of progress are we willing to accept? Which ones should we pursue? And Julia knows, 5 years ago today, I was in a coma, an induced coma. I've had 20 surgeries in the last 5 years as of April 10th. And it's only because, I had a birth defect that takes 50 or 60 years to show up. And doctor didn't quite resolve it without 3 critical errors. Puncturing my aortic artery, my celiac artery, and my hepatic artery.
Wait.
So, they had to induce a coma so that they could figure out where the bleeders were coming from and try to stop it. And they kept me that way for 3 weeks. And then I was in a hospital for 3 months, and I've had my abdomen reconstructed twice. Just follow-up stuff. He screwed up. I'm glad that this birth defect was understood scientifically about a dozen years ago. They did have a surgical solution. Somebody was skilled enough to fix it in me, and I'm not dead. I should be. At the time, they told my wife to prepare for a funeral. So I read this story now very differently
Sure.
than I did years ago. And it's, I like the way your freshman students handle it.
I do too. Absolutely, they can teach something to another.
Yeah, there's something about, be careful of that, you know, that 8 years later you're like, I'm God, I can do this. You can figure it out.
Don't forget that. Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, and as you were pointing out earlier, when Mary Shelley was writing, these kinds of things were just inconceivable, right?
Exactly.
But when Vonnegut was writing this,
He saw technology.
He saw it, and you know, suddenly, I mean, just within a few years, what you otherwise would have died from, you know, people no longer were dying at all, and that shift that happened mid-20th, century, significant, and I think we see some of that reflected here. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, the one thing I found interesting is that in Mary Shelley's piece, there's no discussion about the pain of age, of becoming older.
Yeah, nobody does.
And so her questions are almost always posed in the forever. Kurt's Sylvia is wondering about what she feels. You know, who's instigating that. There's an understanding on stage and off that Sylvia is not in control. Someone else is. They're driving the ship. And this is something we're able to do now. And at what cost? You know, Vonnegut does this medically in this story. So much, only Galapagos really deals with it medically as well. Man's perpetuated, but in so doing, pretty much is sea lions. And then there's the question of whether or not that's an improvement on humanity. I've often thought about that. But this story is much more involved with pain. Physical control of pain, constantly being measured, applied, metered. There's nowhere else, and Kurt does this, everywhere else pain is psychological. The PTSD, which now we speak about, it's had many different names over the years, but in all the other books, none of it is about the pain of awareness. Excuse me, it is about the pain of awareness. It's not about the pain of, I can't believe this is my lot in life. They are, I think, trapped in Kurt's quandary of having lived through Dresden, conventional bombing, hearing about and then later seeing films about Hiroshima, and then watching his brother make rain where there was none. After a while, things are magical. And at that point, your imagination is free to go anywhere, which enables, I guess, the fourth-year students to look at this and say, we have something for this.
Right.
We can do this.
Yeah.
Which is really a natural human inclination. We want to solve problems.
Right. So I do want to open this up to a larger conversation, but I have a couple of other things that I think would be interesting to touch on before we do that. I want to think about I want to think about all the characters, but I think maybe Sylvia, or Gloria.
Gloria.
Yeah, and what do we make of Gloria? Does she really get it more than anyone else? And my other question has to do with Sylvia and the spark that Gloria identifies within Sylvia at times. And what do you think that's about?
You know, that's a very anti-Vonnegutian thing, because that would presume that there is an essence that is beyond life. Kurt didn't believe that, as everybody here probably knows. So in that sense, that was the bit of romance, the vaudevillian side of this story. Because I think that's what an audience is attracted by. And if we were to convince everybody here of faith that it was worthless, that you'd go home rather depressed. But if you leave here both with your faith and with your joy in reading, that's much more healthy. And no one would want to take that from somebody. I think Kurt was hitting this culmination point in the late 60s, just as Slaughterhouse was coming out, which is why I think this story at this point in his career is about the physical pain. He says, yeah, I saw this, I did that, but you picked up bodies. Your body got worn down picking up other bodies, picking up rubble and lifting them out and being cursed in the streets. He never writes about that, in real detail. But then in the next year, the big book comes out, Slaughterhouse, which covers the major PTSD question at hand. So between the two works in 68, 69, I think that we have expressions of Kurt's enduring physical pain and what it is, and understanding that, gee, do we really want to control emotions forever? I mean, give it a rest. Let there be death. And then in 69, there's this question of, this damn thing's driven me crazy, which is a mental health issue. Do you teach that book as well?
No, that's the English department, but maybe I will. Be careful. No, I don't. I do it first edition copy.
Oh, really?
I do, yeah.
Oh.
We can talk about that later. Great. And Gloria, what do you make of Gloria? Then
Well, aptly named,
yeah.
as they all seem to be, pretty much. I think Gloria does get it. I think that she does believe that this is not life any longer. And that spark that she sees is manufactured. I think she understands this in the end. But that there is this glint of reality that Sylvia is, she's still there somewhere.
Still there somewhere.
And that's the spark, But how often can you really control all of those chemicals to just get it right?
Yeah.
I mean, all of us are just like a smidgen away from a brain chemistry problem. And it doesn't take much. So I think that, I think Gloria gets it. She's with her every day, she talks to her, and she's concerned about her and what she's thinking. Whereas everybody else is just measuring, metering, monitoring, administering. They're not really considering you. And that's where maybe the bedside manner comes in. You have to consider.
Right. And it's interesting because Gloria is, the least educated. She's dumb, right? She learns dumb things for dumb people. And,
But she's compassionate.
But she seems to understand something about the human condition that maybe nobody else does.
Yeah, she sees that, she says, this is it right.
Yeah.
And so she takes action.
Yeah. Oh, what fun. Well, shall we open
Please.
up for comments and questions? So if anybody has any.
Listening to this, I find it a little, I'm living some of this. I'm on dialysis. And so I've got a machine that's next to my bed that I stick a couple of huge needles into my arm every other night and watch my blood come out of my body and go through plumbing and go through a machine and come back into me and
Did you name the machine?
no.
Okay.
Well, we call it the machine. And, but either way, you know, without that machine,
That's right.
or that part of me that's robotic in a way, I would have died years ago. And most people wouldn't have any idea unless I told them that I rely on something like that. And, but I do have friends on Facebook that have gotten to the point to where they're so tired of being on the machine that, you know, they decide they're just not going to do it anymore. And one of the fortunate things about kidney disease is you just fall asleep and eventually just don't wake up again. And I mean, it's not a super painful thing to go through, but from what I hear, I don't really want to experience it, but still, that when Vonnegut would have been writing this is when dialysis would have first started.
Just started, yeah.
Just started, and they did, at that time, they did what was nocturnal dialysis. People did it while they were sleeping, and now most people go into, the unfortunate people go into centers, and they have technicians that poke them and prod them, and are a lot of times very uncaring, and they're just doing their procedures, and
And they're not next to a Howard Johnson's ethical suicide.
I'm fortunate that I do all of it myself with my wife's help, and so I have control over stuff like that, and you know, I'm in charge of stuff, but I also get to do it nocturnally, which is a rare thing now. But most people have to do it during the day, and they have to take a bunch of time out of their schedule. And
Is that because of the cost of the individual machines?
no, it's because of fear of the, they don't want people sleeping with needles in their arms. They're afraid they'll pull them out and bleed to death. And so I take special precautions, and I have sensors that are on me, and you know, stuff like that, that if the sensors get wet, they alarm, and things like that. So I sleep for 9 hours, and I toss and turn, and I got hoses that I'm pulling all around and stuff. And
When was the first time you read Fortitude?
I haven't. No. Tonight would have been the first time. Yeah, so I found it really interesting to think of the plumbing and stuff, because I lived that. It's my life.
And you're grateful for it, right, well?
Yeah, I mean, for now, I've been pretty grateful for it. I mean, I know people who've done it for 40 years now, and which is amazing. And so I find the possibility of me living into my 80s possible, even if I'm stuck on a machine. You know, but though I'm waiting on a kidney transplant, hopefully. That's one of the reasons we moved to Indianapolis, so I can be closer to the hospital.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I found this as, I mean, this being my first time hearing the story, I found it as very interesting, since it's my life.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah, as I said, I feel the same way now, post 20 surgeries.
Yeah. I mean, now whether I would shoot somebody else to stick them on my machine, now as a vendetta possibly, if they were the ones forcing me.
Remember, it was a short play.
If they were the ones forcing me to be on the machine, yeah, I'd possibly consider something along those lines, you know, hey, watch this, you son of a bitch, you know.
Although you're able to go on with your life, like
Yeah.
Sylvia, she's stuck. You know,
She's
it's
stuck.
just a head, and you know, she's
wouldn't be here
completely
tonight.
at the mercy
Right.
of her caretakers.
Now, she must have had something besides just her head, though, or they wouldn't have had something that she could have.
Oh, see, now you're getting a little sciencey.
Because they're saying that she couldn't point a gun at herself.
Right,
She
she
had
had
some,
mechanical arms so she could knit,
Yeah.
but they didn't make her hands so that she could point something or stab herself with knitting needles.
oh, I see.
So she could only go so far with it, so she'd like be knitting out here kind of thing.
I see, okay.
That's kind of gonna bring up, so like we watched the movie Lit, and it's just like when someone wants to go, like give them that option, like DNR, like she wanted to go, she wanted to die, she was sick of it. She realized what Gloria was saying, like, she's missing that spark, and it's just like, we base so much stuff on research now and wanting to keep people alive, but it's like, when is enough, like, enough is enough for that person? Like, where do they want to go? It's not like, why is it the doctor's choice? Like, why can't? Sometimes I feel like it's so hidden. Because, have you seen the movie Wit?
No. I know about it, though.
So her nurse basically told her she had the option to be DNR and not a code. And that's like something that was kind of hidden from her. And it's just like, is that something that's hidden from more people? Like, you have the option not to continue this. Do you want to continue it or not? And it's just like that, this story kind of reminded me of like she wanted to go, but she had no option.
It's interesting to think of the two together. So with the Pulitzer Prize winning play written by Margaret Edson that has been turned into a fantastic film. I think HBO produced it, but anyway, it's definitely worth reading and watching.
Are you saying WIT?
Wit,
W-I-T?
W-I-T, Wit.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, it's really, really good. And both, reading it and watching it. Emma Thompson's the star, so how can I not? But it's interesting, and I think what we're talking about here is autonomy, right? And so we think of limited autonomy with children, but not necessarily with adults, right? Like Sylvia Lovejoy, does she have full autonomy here? It doesn't seem that she does, right?
She had her personhood taken away because she can't make decisions.
Yeah.
And I
Because she's
think, I think the spark, I think that is the most important part of the whole story to me. And I think Vonnegut knew that. It was also the most important part of the story.
You want to say more
I
about that?
disagree with Mark on that, and Mark loves that I disagree. We love to argue with each other on things.
So how do you think of
I
the
accept
spark?
all readings, don't worry.
What was your
How do you think of the spark? How do you-
To me, the spark is the thing. I mean, Vonnegut suffered from, depression, PTSD, and he attempted suicide in his lifetime. And, he would go to the post office to see the woman who worked there who had the Indian little bindi on her forehead. And it was those kinds of little joys throughout his day, the sparks that kept him going when he suffered severely from loneliness and depression, PTSD, and these things. And so I appreciate your comments because there is that part of like, okay, the spark is being alive. That's what it is. And then so the story is so interesting to think about what,
I agree.
what
Part of the irony of this, I believe, is the manner of Kurt's own death. Kurt was brain dead before they pulled the plug on him 2 weeks later. Obviously, his son, the pediatrician, could understand the medical aspects of all of this and could explain it to the family. But where was Kurt at that point? Was Kurt even in existence at that point?
And he had said that he did not want to be kept alive by
Exactly.
machines if he was in that state, so.
The Vonnegut family expression, he and his father and uncle always used to say, when they were experiencing a good moment in their life, if this isn't nice, I don't know what is. That was kind of the spark in the Vonnegut family expression, take a moment to stop and say, if this isn't nice, I don't know what is. Sort of, mindfulness of enjoyment of that particular moment. And Slaughterhouse-Five kind of solves the problem of death in a way through the Tralfamadorians, for whom time is not a thing. Every moment, it is each moment of the past, and it is the
Including
present.
death.
And it is every moment of the future. So they're not sad when someone passes away because they are happy in the past, which is now.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
in that sense, I think he kind of solved
It's
the
a
problem
Mobius strip
death
of
for us.
time. Do you know what a Mobius strip is? So you really have one side in the end once you put it together. And you just go round and round and round, like the Speedway.
There we go. Indianapolis reference, there we go. Yeah.
Am I remembering correctly, did Mary Shelley make an appearance in Dr. God Bless You as an interviewee in
Yes,
bless you.
God
Dr.
bless you, Dr. Kevorkian.
And what, I remember that happened, but I had forgotten what the interview was like. Can you say a little bit
Well,
about?
put it this way, at the very end of it, you know, Kurt references the fact that most people confuse who the monster is,
Right.
as you alluded to before. And he has Mary Shelley say, well, there are two monsters. So, I think Kurt would probably agree with Mary Shelley, not just put those words in her mouth.
You talked about people being aptly named. One, I'm old enough to find it very funny that Mr. Vonnegut chose one of his characters to be named Tom Swift. And to have that character say howdy doody. But what I wanted to ask you was,
and YouTube.
what I wanted to ask you was, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein seemed to be concerned with prolonging life in general, while Kurt Vonnegut's Frankenstein character seemed to be concerned with prolonging his life. Do you feel that?
Actually, I think of the book, Frankenstein, as, let's see if I can create life. Not what I do with it. Once, you know, what I'm supposed to be responsible for, you know, the way we hopefully plan our parenthood. So those were never considerations. For him it was, can I do this? Do I have the ability? Is the science there? But we don't see the science, because she doesn't know the science. But the big questions remain. But she does it in, as I said, the most, I think, a really sentimental way. That's the way I read the book. And I find the one sap in it is Dr. Frankenstein just doesn't get it. You know, thick as a brick. Watches his friend die. He just doesn't get it.
I was surprised in Fortitude, though, like at the very end, he's like, oh, this works for two people. I'll be the second.
Well, you wonder if it becomes like a hub where you can just stick in this room will fit 8 heads. You know, we can do that, and the guts could be in the other room. And we could all exist as networked nodes.
It's also very similar because he, you know, they said it couldn't be done. Well, yes, it can, right? And which is very Frankentinian.
For me.
Yeah, right. Yeah. You can do it now. It's done before. Yeah.
And I watched the movie this afternoon, and
Fun.
they didn't bother putting things like facts.
Right.
Kurt always, almost always, uses characters that he has some reference, like Dr. Frankenstein, Tom Swift, etc. Places that he mentions the same way. In Fortitude, he mentions MIT, which both his father and grandfather went to. But I've never figured out exactly why he mentions Vermont.
You know, he does that in slapstick as well. And all I can think of is he lived for so long on the Cape that he understood New England. You know, I didn't really make much more of it than that. And as I said, I didn't try to ask him questions about why he did this or that. I just wanted to find out how you do it. How's your ticker? It was a kind of different.
First I remember Bernard when he left GE, he moved to New England. Was it Massachusetts or was he in Vermont?
I don't know. Did he go, Julia, do you know?
I don't know, but Vermont had popped up before,
Right.
because they have some of his papers, and I don't know.
At the University of Vermont?
Yeah, not an extensive collection like I do,
Do they have
but
slapstick?
I don't think so.
Because that's the Vermont.
Interesting. I always just thought, you know, family doctor from Vermont, how benign can you be, right? So, but yeah, I'm sure there's more to it. I'm not sure.
You know, he didn't really place anything west of Indianapolis for the most part.
Good. Yeah, yeah.
Everybody's discussing this from the medical and prolonging life aspect, but I think there's another big theme in here that was in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein about what is love. and how do you express that? You know, how did Dr. Frankenstein express love? Not very well, but to his creature. And it really bothered me that in the end, I felt like Dr. Frankenstein in this was serving himself out of his love for this lady. It just did not seem to me like my definition of love. There did not seem to me to be any real caring for her in what he was doing.
I think he cared about her, and I think he did love her in some twisted, warped way.
But I felt that so much more of what he did
Was self-serving.
was self-serving.
Absolutely.
That's the perfect word for it.
It was, and you know, in Frankenstein, we wish that Frankenstein would show some attention, right? Be there, support, you know, instead of just fleeing in horror. And so we see almost an extreme contrast with fortitude, right? Not only will I devote all of my attention to you, but I will also join you. But that doesn't work either, you know, we're bothered by that as well. It's interesting. Good. I think you were next and then Leslie.
And just a comment towards the previous discussion about how fast things change. One item that jumped out at me was, so Sylvia doesn't have a choice in her continued existence. This is done by Frankenstein, but in today's world, it's often done by the insurance company, right? So the pharmaceutical may not even develop a drug if it's only going to prolong life a month or two. It'll never end up on a formulary somewhere. So you talk about there being 2 monsters, and now I think of there possibly being 3 monsters controlling whether life would continue or not.
And who has access to those?
Correct.
Right, yeah. Absolutely.
And he alludes to it. There's a line about if you can afford it.
And he
Well,
talks about the
when
cross.
we had Martin Shelley recently, the farmer bro,
Right.
you know, who jacked up AIDS medication like 5,000 times or something like that, 5,000%. There was so much upsetness across the country about it because all of these questions came up. At what price life? And who are you serving after a while? Because nobody's going to be able to afford it. And unless they really think the government's going to pay for it. What price life? And then I think in Sylvia's extreme case, when's enough enough? When is the spark gone? And put it to rest.
And who makes the decision? Who has the control?
And Sylvia stripped of it. That's
Correct.
the terrible.
And soon I think the doctors will be stripped of it as well, as it goes to the insurance companies.
Maybe that will change too.
Marc Vonnegut talks about that a lot, being a pediatrician. He's often going off on the insurance companies, and he's pretty ballsy when he does that, some of the stuff he says. It's fun to listen to him talk.
It's a different discussion to discuss the administration of healthcare.
Yeah, because they have that drone. But, yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about a lot when we were talking about the sparks was like that she was, Sylvia was losing her spark, but I think at the same time, Frankenstein was losing the spark at the same time. Like listening to both of your guys' experience, like in the hospital, you guys saw both sides of it, like being part of it, being hooked up to the machines, and also like from the outside. I think that they were inside the machines for, I think, the 35 years.
Right.
That they kind of lost sight of the rest of the world.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So I think Gloria might have been the only one who really understood. Not even the doctors really understood. Only Gloria could.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Gloria is the only one who seems to interact with the rest of the world on a regular basis. She's only there 3 times a week. It would seem to me when I read it that Frankenstein is there almost all the time. He's got an apartment above them. That's the way I've always read it. That
He has one
she's
patient.
never out of his sight.
He has one patient.
But he treats the whole patient.
It's all over there.
I think, I'm watching the clock. Do we have time for one more, or should we?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more.
Or should we, okay,
I was just gonna make a comment
Yeah.
quick. A lot of these themes remind me of the Blade Runner 2049.
Yes.
What does it mean to be human? That whole love story between the robots. This kind of reminded me. A lot of those themes are in that movie. So.
Absolutely. My
Well, now you know
students
where
are-
it's sourced from.
Yeah. Makes sense.
I'll take this opportunity to ask the last question, as is my right. So if from each of you, another text of Vonnegut's or otherwise, if people interested in this idea about, how long should we prolong life, what are the ethics involved here, do you have a text that pops to the top of your head that we should all read?
Yes.
I'm retired, I go first.
Besides Frankenstein.
Yeah, I know. So I can think of a lot, but two come to mind. For those who enjoy film, I will recommend Gattaca. For those who want to read some Nathaniel Hawthorne, I would certainly recommend The Birthmark.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
we use these all together
great story.
sometimes. So, and then there's a great essay written by Michael Sandel called The Case Against Perfection. That's a nice complement to all of those together. So I'll stop, but I could, yes, those come to
Great.
mind.
I used to read a lot of Lewis Thomas.
Yeah, oh, of course.
And
Wonderful
The
mistake.
Panda's Thumb.
Yeah,
And
good.
what I found so interesting about Lewis Thomas is that it was so easy to bring into a composition classroom or even an introduction to literature classrooms so that people understood that literature was more than, oh, these two people fell in love and, whatever, the Cinderella story, whatever you want to do, that there's so much more to be had in that. So I found, that to be most useful in the class. But if you were to go Kurt at that point, if you wanted to look for another Vonnegut, is that what the question really is?
Sure, yeah.
I would say Galapagos, because in reading Galapagos, one has to accept Vonnegut's vision of at least posing the question, is life better off somewhat dumbed down, sea lion level, so that you have an awareness and a survival skill, but you're not a scheming, killing machine as humans have become. And I think that's a hard one to grasp, because you're sort of rooting for humanity, and then when we transform, a lot of people are unsettled by that, and I'm not. So I think that's one extension of this concept.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank Mark and Emily. I want to tell you to get more food before you leave. We have a ton left over. And I want to hand it over to Julia from the Museum and Library to say a few things.
Hi, so yes, I'm Julie Whitehead. I'm the founder and CEO of the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library. Before I thank people who are here, I want to thank someone who is not here. Dr. Marc Leeds, when I worked for Lilly and I had the idea for the Vonnegut Library, I got in an elevator and it's full of Lilly employees, and this guy Mark starts telling bad jokes, really horrible jokes as we're trying to go up this elevator. And people get off, and then I turned to him and I said, are you a Vonnegut fan? Because I just knew. Sure enough, Dr. Marc Leeds was a Vonnegut fan. He became one of our first board members along with Marc Leeds and others. But Marc Leeds was also a board chair, and he's a board member now as well. But as board chair, we'd go around to donors, and he would tell this story about how he was 16 and he snuck a copy of Playboy, and there was a story called Fortitude, and that informed his medical ethics and inspired him to want to be a doctor and all of these things. And that's why Mark went on to be a doctor, and he told the story so many times that I could almost sit there and say it as he's telling the story. And unfortunately, he couldn't be here tonight the one time. The story is more relevant than it ever has been before, but he does send his regards. I also want to say how grateful I am to Indiana Humanities, because when they approached us with this idea of Vonnegut and Frankenstein, it's like, oh, we have Vonnegut and First Amendment, Vonnegut and gun control, Vonnegut and this and that, and Vonnegut and Frankenstein, sure, of course. Monday, I get on the phone, Marc Leeds, expert. I don't think we quite realize Vonnegut Encyclopedia and what that means. Marc Leeds is the expert on all things Kurt Vonnegut. So, Marc, where do we go with this? And we are so grateful that you were able to make your way out here for this with the help of Indiana Humanities. Every time I go to New York, Marc picks me up at the airport. He is a former taxi driver, so that's not always ideal, but he is always there. He is always there to help me with my
How much do you charge her for?
She buys me lunch.
Which, New York.
She also does a cheap date.
So, I also want to thank Dr. Emily Beckmann. When we heard she was going to be moderating this discussion, my first thought was, yes, someone so incredibly intelligent and compassionate. I am always grateful to have the opportunity to sit with Dr. Emily Beckmann. The readers, so our very own Meredith, who played the role of Sylvia, took off from Billy Collins. Okay, new. But, I mean, we hire these different theater companies to do dramatic readings for us, and I think right here at our audience, we've got our next event where we're doing dramatic readings. I also want to thank Indiana Humanities again for the walking tour that we were able to put together in 2017 with the support provided by Indiana Humanities. If you haven't seen this, we have a nice brochure in the library. Step in and get a copy of that. It's a great walking tour of things Vonnegut in Indianapolis. We also want to thank you for recently announcing that we are able to bring in the Seattle journalist turned novelist Jess Walter, who is one of our friends and honorary board members. He wrote the book Beautiful Ruins that I believe is being made into a movie. Maybe it has been. I haven't seen that yet. He will be at the Iowa Writers Workshop teaching in September when we feature Banned Books Week, and we are grateful for the support that allows us to bring him in. This is our Lonesome No More theme this year. Kurt Vonnegut's wonderful slapstick with the idea of lonesome no more. We don't often add, it's also lonesome, thank God, if you're in that camp who wants the peace and quiet. But we've been able to do some very cool things this year with regard to mental health, and we are on May 16th holding our next event that relates to curbing loneliness and support for mental health. We'll have people who are suffering from different mental health challenges, talking about their illnesses, and we'll also have some doctors who specialize in addiction, schizophrenia, and I believe bipolar and depression is the other.
I've come back for all of this.
Yeah, I mean, you're always welcome, Mark, always welcome. So that is May 16th. Please go to VonnegutLibrary.org to get your free ticket for that event. I want to thank also Indiana Humanities for the awesome logo.
We have some left to make sure you pick up some more buttons on your way out.
How fun is that? We love that. Thank you for that. And then I mentioned Banned Books Week in September with Jess Walter. We also have Vonnegut Fest. We have a lot going on. I won't go into all the details of that. But I am going to say we are working with Salman Rushdie to bring him out. That's not until April. So, all the things that pop up in April with all the other organizations, put us first because you're not going to want to miss Salman Rushdie. We have this feeling that the hit that was put out on his life by the Ayatollah, if we remember that is still active. So we're hoping it doesn't happen during the Vonnegut Library event, although we've had people say, no, you want it to happen during the Vonnegut Library event, Mr. Rushdie. No, we don't want that to happen.
No, you just want an unsuccessful attempt so
There
you
you
get
go.
all the news.
There you go.
Yes. So thank you all, and especially.
We have an advisory board member.
We do.
It sounds like.
We have Kathleen Angelone, our wonderful wonderful advisory board member. We have Bill Briscoe, who is our historian for the organization with us tonight as well. So just generally, thanks for showing up for these things. We love these kinds of discussions, and we look forward to seeing you with our other events later in the year. Thanks for attending.
Thank you, everybody.